Today's episode is a recording of a webinar organized by the Permanent Mission of Rwanda to the United Nations to commemorate the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. The panelists, Mr. Castro Wasamba, the Chief of Office, United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect; Dr. Sara Brown, Executive Director at the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights and Genocide Education; Dr. Zachary Kaufman, Associate Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of Houston Law Center; Dr. Lonzen Rugira, Applied Policy Researcher, Academic and Public Affairs Commentator; and Dr. Doris Uwicyeza, Doctoral Fellow and Legal Researcher, discuss how digital technology is used to perpetuate genocide denial as well as strategies to counter it.
Hello, everyone. I am Doris Uwicyeza. I'm a Doctoral Fellow in Public International Law at the University of Pretoria, and I will be moderating this webinar. We are having a timely and necessary discussion on how digital technology is being used to perpetuate genocide denial, and we're going to discuss the strategies to counter it. This discussion is hosted by the Permanent Mission of Rwanda to the United Nations in partnership with the UN Department of Global Communications. The webinar is part of a series of discussions guiding the 27th commemoration of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda. I would like to begin by thanking all of our distinguished attendees for joining us in this webinar. We have a very diverse audience. We have diplomats, parliament representatives, scholars, students, and interested individuals. Thank you so much for joining us in this discussion. We are intending to give you a dynamic and interactive discussion, and we want to hear your thoughts. So there will be a Q&A portion towards the end of this discussion to enable you to interact with the panelists and ask them questions or share your thoughts and comments. We are striving to give you an informative conversation on online hate speech and misinformation, especially as it pertains to the genocide against the Tutsis. To this effect, we've assembled a great panel of experts from various sectors to provide us with an interdisciplinary perspective on online hate speech and genocide denial. I would like to thank and warmly welcome our esteemed panelists. I will begin by introducing you first to Mr. Castro Wasamba. Mr. Wasamba is the Chief of Office of the United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. Prior to joining the United Nations, Mr. Wasamba worked for the government of Kenya for 13 years, serving in different positions covering regional peace, security, human rights, and other multilateral issues. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Wasamba. I would also like to introduce Dr. Sara Brown, who is the Executive Director of Change, which is the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights and Genocide Education. Dr. Brown holds the first PhD in Comparative Genocide Studies from Clark University's Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. She has worked and conducted research in Rwanda since 2004. She served as a project coordinator in refugee camps in Tanzania. She's worked in refugee settlement centers in Texas and has researched conflict, globalization, and conflict in Israel. Dr. Brown also currently serves on the advisory board of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. Thank you for joining us, Sarah. We also have Dr. Zachary Kaufman. Dr. Kaufman is the Associate Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of Houston Law Center, where he teaches criminal law, international law, and international and transitional justice. He also holds appointment at the university's Department of Political Science and has written extensively on the topic of genocide, especially on genocide in Rwanda. Last but certainly not least, joining us from Kigali is Dr. Lonzen Rugira. Dr. Lonzen is a Rwandan independent consultant in applied policy research and a public affairs commentator. He's a former academic at Howard University and at the University of Rwanda. We will soon give the floor to these panelists to introduce themselves to you and give you introductory remarks. First, I'd like to give a quick reminder to all speakers to switch off their microphones when they're not speaking. Well, there is so much to discuss on this important topic, and we have such a great and diverse panel, which will provide us, like I say, with multiple perspectives on on how to approach the combat against online hate speech in general and genocide denial in particular. Genocide denial and revisionism are essentially a form of hate speech in that they are aimed at stripping genocide survivors and victims of their dignity and humanity. Hate speech and hate propaganda incited and fueled the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda through traditional media. Currently, with new technology, we have a free and open internet, which provides immense social value and connects the world by broadly expanding access to information. However, the internet is now also being used to create, incubate, and spread large-scale campaigns of misinformation and hate speech. Social media platforms are being used to perpetuate genocide denial, distortion, and revisionism of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis. It is known that an upsurge in hate speech online inevitably leads to offline violence. The purpose of our discussion is to analyze and shed light on the methods and practice employed in the crafting and spreading online hate and genocide denial. Our discussion will also assess the tools and policies available to internet companies, digital platforms, policymakers, media groups, academia, and the public to counter hate, extremism, and genocide denial online. Without further ado, I would like to thank and welcome two very special guests. We have with us Ms. Melissa Fleming, who has graciously agreed to record opening remarks for us. Ms. Fleming is the Undersecretary General of the UN Department of Global Communications. We also have with us Mr. Robert Kayinamura, who is the Chargé d'Affaires and Deputy Representative of the Rwandan Permanent Mission to the UN. Mr. Kayinamura will be delivering closing remarks at the end of this session. I would like to thank both of them for taking part in this. So I will now give the floor to Mrs. Fleming for her opening remarks streamed to us.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Fleming, and I'm the Under Secretary General for Global Communications at the United Nations. I'm pleased to welcome you to this virtual event organized by the Permanent Mission of Rwanda, which will explore how digital technology is used to perpetrate genocidal denial and how to identify strategies to try to counter it. Today's discussion is taking place during Kwibuka, the annual days of remembrance of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, where more than 1 million people were murdered in less than 3 months. The victims were overwhelmingly Tutsi, but also Hutu and others who opposed the genocide. As UN General Secretary General Antonio Guterres remarked at this year's observance of the International Day of Reflection, quote, "Those days in 1994 remain in our collective conscience as among the most horrific in recent human history." The UN's Department of Global Communications manages the outreach program on the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. This is an information and education program to mobilize civil society for genocide remembrance and education to help prevent future atrocities. We know that respecting historical integrity is essential in educating about the histories of mass atrocity and genocide. Denials and distortions of history are important tools in the arsenal of those who spread misinformation. Indeed, we live in a world facing an infodemic of disinformation and misinformation. The hateful and destructive views and distortions of extremist groups are amplified exponentially through digital technology. As we look at today's threats, let us ensure that we heed the lessons of 27 years ago. While the technology that extremists use might have evolved, the techniques and the vile content of the messaging have not. We must remain vigilant. I wish you an enriching discussion today as you explore what actions could and should be taken to strengthen our responses and ensure that history is not rewritten or denied, and that trusted, impartial information is accessible to all. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Ms. Flaming for her important message on the importance of historical facts and fighting distortion and misinformation online. I will now give the floor to our first panelist, Mr. Kaba, for his introductory remarks. Mr. Wasamba.
Thank you very much, Doris. Good afternoon, good morning, and dear participants. First, let me just thank the Permanent Mission of Rwanda for convening this very important webinar and to make some reflections as part of Kwibuka 27 about the role of digital technology in disseminating hate speech, genocide denial, and to perpetuating what has been of most concern. As Doris, you have given the background and in the statement by Madam Melissa Fleming, we know very well what the role of hate speech did in preparing the ground for the commission of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda in 1994. So, this event is really speaks to the heart of the problem. It's recognized that if we don't take early measures to prevent this kind of speech, including genocide denial, then we are failing in prevention, because hate speech has been a precursor of some of the most violent acts, including the genocide against the Tutsi itself. Whereas there is no international definition of what hate speech is, and at the same time, we are operating in an environment where we have to strictly adhere to international standards of the freedoms of opinion and expression. It remains of very much concern of how it is spreading like a wildfire across the whole world, across all the regions. But most disturbingly, as we do the reflection of the Kwibuka 27, and to honor the victims of the Rwanda genocide in 1994 against the Tutsi, is to discuss how practically can we counter this hate speech and genocide denial in itself. The role of media, digital technology is huge, and they're playing a very important role in disseminating the information very fast and to a very wide audience. And therefore, I will use the 5 minutes just to do some reflections, as our office is the focal point within the UN system on countering and addressing hate speech, because this is what leads to genocide and other related atrocity crimes. And therefore, I will just use this opportunity to bounce some ideas off to the participants. For us to do more in terms of addressing and countering online hate speech, and what is the role of the social and tech media companies. They're very, very important and important partners, and they can do something. That way, we will be confident that we are addressing the triggers to discrimination, violence, and in the worst form, genocide and related atrocity crimes. Allow me to just point out a few points that we have been discussing within the UN system in terms of how do we deal with digital technology and dissemination of hate speech, and in this context, including genocide denial. One is that we have to work in partnership with these tech companies, particularly the big tech companies, social media companies, Facebook, Google, Twitter, and others, to increase transparency in terms of how they moderate content, on online content on itself. We have, in our discussions, we have learned that in most of these companies, it is a little bit more automated. And it's not just, kind of like very clear in terms of how the content is addressed. I think it's one thing to say that you're removing the content, but there is another thing to say how the process of removing that content. I think we have seen hateful messages, that are disseminated around the world, and including genocide denial, that are, disseminated very broadly. But the transparency in terms of how those companies, undertake to remove that content is very much concerning. That it cannot be left to be automated and self-reporting. So, we need to do a little bit more to work with the digital companies to increase transparency in terms of how they remove that content. They should work with journalists. They should work with the communities, including survivors of like past genocide, to understand the impact of what is being posted there, that it is in the context of those communities. It is very hateful on itself. That transparency is very important. The second point that we can discuss in detail is accountability of these digital, technology companies. We respect the principle of self-regulation. It's important that they increase the accountability in terms of how they're responding to these hate messages that is disseminated across their platforms. And this has been a point of, that clearly we don't find that there are proper structures in terms of accountability of how hate speech and genocide denial is addressed on those platforms. I would also like to say that, we have to do more advocacy for these digital companies to adopt rights-respecting, business model. It's really very disturbing. We know very well, and it's a matter of fact, that genocide was committed against the Tutsi in 1994. So genocide denial is somehow infringing on the rights of the survivors. And it is very important that we encourage these tech and social media companies to improve their business models and be aware of the rights of the victims of hate speech and genocide denial itself. And that way they will be more responsive on the content and process of, controlling or bringing down any expressions of hate against such victim groups. There is another point, I'm almost in 5 minutes, quickly, is establish independent oversight mechanisms. These are businesses, but in terms of oversight, it's a bit very opaque. And who moderates the companies under international law for them to be compliant in terms of addressing incitement, hate speech, and genocide denial on itself. And my last point, and then I can delve into some of these points in Q&A, is that if we have to address hate speech and genocide denial, we must also focus on the leaders, political leaders, public figures. Sometimes it's very disturbing when opinion leaders are led because they have million followers to not to be actually, sort of addressed because the proportionality and the impact of these kind of leaders is huge. And therefore, if they disseminate, messages of hate, genocide, denial with a huge following of online media, then in itself, it undermines our efforts to do the prevention and the reflections about the survivors on themselves. Sarah, last point, which, and then I can stop over there, is that, we must foster engagement with civil society and affected communities, which I have said, we have to encourage that these digital companies, Facebook, Twitter, Google, TikTok, and all this, that they have to reach out to the affected communities, that this kind of event should be used absolutely as a platform to raise the concerns that they are not responsive to those who are working on these very important issues on themselves. I'll stop over there, and then we can delve into more of the details on this. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Castro, for highlighting the role of these social media companies and for discussing all the important stakeholders that need to be brought into the conversation in terms of civil society and the survivors, actually, and opinion leaders. This is something that will definitely come up a bit later in the discussion and will be asked to expand a bit upon. For now, I'd like to give the floor to Sara Brown. Sara?
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Permanent Mission of Rwanda, to the United Nations, and the UN Department of Global Communications for organizing this program. It's a really important topic, and I'm so pleased to be here with my co-panelists, and also you as our moderator, Ms. Uwicyeza. Thank you, everyone, also in the audience, for joining us. This is a really important conversation. And as I was thinking about the conversation and where it may go, I was thinking about the use of mass media and the fact that it is used to exacerbate tensions, sow fear and division and manipulate, these are all not new. Even though maybe the most recent and popular iteration, social media, the internet, the latest means for reaching an audience that is both instantaneous and now really truly global, that is all new. But as a scholar and as a historian and as a genocide studies student and learner for life, I have examined and spoken about the role of mass media, including the role of radio and print, in particular during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. And one of the things that I wanted to just flag is that in Rwanda, in 1994 and before, those extremists maneuvering for power harnessed the most popular means of mass communications at that time in order to exacerbate and promote divisions between Hutu and Tutsi. And those manipulations took many forms. They were political messages and decrees, illustrations, print materials, radio programs, and they were woven together in a way to ensure that the population was subjected to a steady onslaught of image, print, and radio influences that all invoke terror and anxiety before, during, and as we even see occurring now, after the genocide. The propagation and the manipulation of this fear took place at every level of society. And through the use of mass media, these messages of fear and divisionism mobilized men and women to perpetrate genocide. And they were used before, during, and now we see after the genocide to deny that the genocide ever even occurred. Today, the internet has become the most popular means of instantaneous mass communication. And I want to flag that while today we'll be talking about many of the more nefarious uses, the benefits are also tremendous. A free and open internet, as you noted, Doris, that it connects us, especially after or really truly during, because we're still in the midst of it, the COVID pandemic, which did so much to separate us. Now, speaking from personal experience at Change, the center where I am a director, the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights and Genocide Education, transitioning to virtual platforms in order to deliver our content meant that we could continue our innovative programming. And that programming is about the Holocaust, human rights, instances of genocide like the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. And it helped us to ensure that our work to continue to promote the elimination of racism, anti-Semitism, prejudice, and genocide denial was able to continue. One of the perks was that we even managed to expand our audience thanks to the internet. In the past 16 months, we've now put on more than 60 programs, and they've reached over 60,000 people across 6 continents. This included our Kwibuka 27 commemorative programming, and in that we are not alone. This year, even as we were self-isolating and socially distanced, I have watched Rwandans around the world gather virtually, like this webinar, for example, and they joined from all corners of the earth in order to remember, unite, and renew. So there are positive benefits to the internet, but at the same time, many of these virtual platforms are being harnessed by genocide deniers, extremists, and hate groups that use it to spread fear, division, and tear apart some of the very fabric that holds our communities, our societies together. The lessons that were learned from, for example, RTLM radio's nefarious strategies, couching hate rhetoric and fear and dehumanizing sentiments into popular music, interactive programming, even radio soap dramas, those lessons unfortunately continue to reverberate among extremists who seek to deny the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi over the internet. I think that is why today's conversation about how digital technology is being used to perpetuate genocide denial and also how to counter it is so very important. I'll hold off answering any of the questions that I believe will be posed by our esteemed moderator and hopefully by the audience as well. But one of the things that I just want to close on, or it's something I've been reflecting on, is that having this open and frank dialogue about how the internet can be harnessed for both evil, but also for good, this is so absolutely important. And I think that in having this webinar, in all of you joining us today, we as a community are selecting the path of action. For us, the path of inaction is not an option. And so I'm honored to be here and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was most enlightening, especially how you highlighted the fact that, the access that and the reach, the broad access and reach that the internet has given to this hate speech has also given us access to true education on the true historical facts and education whereby you can correct some of the misinformation that is out there. And that is something that is actually quite important in the combat against online hate speech and genocide denial. So thank you very much for that. Now I'll give the floor to Dr. Zachary Kaufman to introduce his remarks to us.
Marikoze Chane, thank you very much for having me here today. Thank you to the Rwandan Mission, to the United Nations, and to the United Nations itself for organizing today's event. It's an honor to be here today with all of you and my distinguished co-panelists for Kwibuka 27, in which we commemorate the 27th anniversary of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. As some of my own relatives were killed during the genocide, the Holocaust, I sympathize with the overwhelming pain and irreplaceable loss so many Rwandans feel. Without a firearm, machete, or any physical weapon, you caused the deaths of thousands of innocent civilians. So wrote the judges at the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in 2003 when convicting Hassan Ngeze, Jean Bosco Barayagwiza, and Ferdinand Nahimana. This trial was path-breaking as it was the first time journalists were found guilty of inciting genocide. As the tribunal recognized, these media executives, leaders of Radio Television Libre de Nokolin, also known as Hate Radio and Radio Machete, and Kangura, a Hutu extremist newspaper, played a significant role in inciting and orchestrating the genocide against the Tutsi. The so-called media trial at the Rwandan tribunal was the first time since World War II that the role of journalists was addressed in the context of international criminal justice. In 1946, judges at the Nuremberg Tribunal convicted Julius Streicher, founder and publisher of the virulently anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, of crimes against humanity. Charging Streicher with genocide or incitement to genocide was not an option, as the term coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1944, just 1 year before the Nuremberg Tribunal started its work, had not yet taken hold as a concept in international law. As Dr. Brown noted, communications technology has included wondrous achievements facilitating connections all over the world and beyond. The problem, of course, is that even neutral tools can be used for catastrophic ill as well as propitious good. And so we must consider how to fairly, legally, and effectively regulate communication to minimize its harms. Examples of the abuse of communication tools abound. The printing press Johannes Gutenberg invented in 1450 made it possible to manufacture books in larger numbers for little cost. And yet some of those books, like Hitler's Mein Kampf, have purposely incited hate and genocide. The radio Guglielmo Marconi invented in 1896 made long-distance communication possible. And yet radio has been used, such as radio television Liber Neoplolene, before and during the genocide against the Tutsi to incite and even orchestrate genocide. The internet, invented between the 1960s and 1980s through the contributions of multiple people, has made information access quick, easy, and relatively cheap all over the world. And yet the most popular social media application on the internet, Facebook, has been used to perpetrate the genocide against the Rohingya and has been blamed for facilitating violence and death elsewhere, including in Sri Lanka and South Sudan. Confronting the ills of communications technology is more challenging now than ever. For example, radio and the internet are similar in some ways, but also feature crucial differences. Radio and the internet are both mass media tools that are accessible for producers and consumers and extremely efficient at quickly sharing messages with large numbers of people. Both radio and internet are widely perceived to be credible sources. But radio is one-directional, whereas the internet, especially social media, is two-directional. And social media reaches further and quicker than radio, and at least for now, currently has fewer regulations. Indeed, Facebook is so widely used in some regions that many of its users confuse it with the internet itself. For many people, Facebook is the only source of information. The increasing prevalence and persuasiveness of so-called deep fakes further confuse social media users about what is real and accurate. On the plus side, as Dr. Brown noted, there are plus sides. Because of the interactive nature of social media, victims can connect to support each other, and activists can raise public awareness about and document and preserve evidence of problems. Given how social media can be and has been used to incite and orchestrate genocide as well as to promote genocide denial, two questions immediately arise. First, how should social media platforms regulate themselves? Second, how should governments regulate social media platforms? Regarding the first question, how should social media platforms regulate themselves, there is cause for great concern that self-regulation is insufficient. Take, for example, the Rohingya genocide. Myanmar military personnel used Facebook as a tool for ethnic cleansing. A UN fact-finding mission concluded that Facebook played a determining role in the violence in Myanmar. Facebook did take down the official accounts of senior Myanmar military leaders. However, Facebook failed to detect the many other accounts used during the propaganda campaign and which had millions of followers. Social media platforms must regulate their own content, and they need to be doing a better job discharging this responsibility. In the case of the Rohingya genocide, Facebook should have realized that it could be manipulated to promote lies through text and images, and should have taken a more active role in investigating and shutting down sham accounts. Facebook and other social media companies should more proactively leverage their own vast resources to fact check, engage with civil society, hire more speakers of the indigenous languages in conflict zones, investigate complaints, act quickly to remove content and accounts that violate their community guidelines and codes of conduct, preserve content offline to be turned over to investigators, and promote digital literacy so that users understand better how to distinguish truth from lies. To their credit, some social media platforms have taken upon themselves to crack down on genocide denial. For example, Facebook now treats Holocaust denial as hate speech rather than mere misinformation. Facebook ultimately adopted this position after noting rising anti-Semitism and the shocking amount of ignorance about the Holocaust. Almost 1 in 4 American millennials and post-millennials believe the Holocaust either never happened or is exaggerated. Regarding the second question, how should governments regulate digital platforms? This question is fraught with the need to balance freedoms with protections. Aggressively combating hate speech and disinformation can negatively impact the freedoms of expression, assembly, and association that are so strongly held here in the United States by the First Amendment to the Constitution, as well as so crucially needed all around the world to promote democracy and protect against authoritarianism. Balancing those interests is an ongoing challenge in which all branches of the US government, for example, engage. Famously, the US Supreme Court ruled in its 1969 landmark case of Brandenburg versus Ohio that inflammatory speech can't be prohibited unless it is directed at inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and it is likely to incite or produce such action. Fortunately, though belatedly, there is a growing recognition that genocide incitement and denial are no mere misinformation that should be protected by free speech rights. Rather, genocide and incitement and denial can and do lead to real harms, including mass atrocities, and should and must be vigorously combated. In closing, I want to return to the idea that communications technology is a neutral tool that can be used for good as well as ill, and then conclude on a hopeful note. Consider Syria, widely regarded to be one of the worst humanitarian crises of the past decade, given the millions of refugees and internally displaced peoples. Syria may very well be the most documented conflict in history. Using social media and mobile phones, millions of images, videos, blogs, tweets, and audio files have been created and shared about the war. This evidence, if properly preserved and authenticated, could be used to pursue the justice and accountability that are so sorely needed. Already, we are seeing significant steps taken through the burgeoning field of media forensics to use techniques of reverse image searching, geolocation, and metadata analysis to prioritize and verify such documentation which we wouldn't have without the neutral tools of the internet. My colleague Gregory Stanton has warned that denial is the final stage of genocide that always follows and often predicts further genocide. For the memories of millions of Armenians, Jews, Cambodians, Tutsi, Bosniaks, Rohingya, Yazidis, Uyghurs, and so many others, the private and public sectors must work together more effectively to jointly combat genocide, incitement, and denial online. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaufman. That was so informative and comprehensive, and I greatly appreciate how you've traced throughout the history all the development in technologies and how it's been always accompanied by people using those new technologies in order to further their hate agenda. And thank you for touching on the responsibilities of these media corporations and their self-regulations or lack thereof, and the shortcomings of these self-regulations is something that will also be coming up in the discussion. So I'd like to thank you for your introductory remark. Now we have our last but not least panelist, Dr. Lonzen Rugira, who will be providing us with his introductory remark.
All right, thank you very much, moderator. I'm glad to be here discussing such an important topic. However, I would like to state that we have started probably in the worst way possible we could start. The Undersecretary Melissa Fleming said that the victims were overwhelmingly Tutsis and others that opposed the genocide against the Tutsi and others who opposed the genocide. That is not factually true. It is factually wrong, and it is inconsistent with the fight against genocide denial, and it actually, that kind of ambiguity is what feeds genocide denial. So when I heard that statement, I had to ask myself whether to leave the panel or to stay. I stayed because, as we will see, some of the genocide denial is unmitigated. So you minimize, you mock unintentionally. And I hope that she did so unintentionally. Otherwise, I would not be here. I would not continue this discussion. Now, the topic at hand, the genocide, the denial on social media. Basically, what is going on? The aim of countering denial is so that we may build a collective consciousness at different levels, at the national level, regional level, international solidarity. So a a kind of society, build a collective consciousness around this tragedy, the tragedy of genocide. So the aim of building that that collective consciousness at these different levels is so that we prevent the recurrence of genocide. So what we are involved in here right now is to ensure that genocide does not recur anywhere. And so it becomes very problematic when a language that facilitates the recurrence of genocide is perpetrated, and even worse, when it is happening from the United Nations. So social media. Social media, we have, the traditional media, how it was used as a platform for perpetuating speech. So what the difference between social media and traditional media is that in traditional media, you had, generally speaking, you had an element of funneling information. So you had editorial processes. And these editorial processes are what brought element of responsibility in discourse, civilized discourse. So the democratization of speech through the platform of social media is that it has removed these processes, the processes that bring a responsibility to speech. So there's more freedom, less responsibility. So we don't have a mechanism for funneling information. We don't have a mechanism for ensuring that responsible information is out there. So this is why it's called a double-edged sword. It's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, it is good that people are getting more information. It's good that people are voicing their views. So that is the positive part. The negative part is that there's so much ignorance that is being perpetuated. So as a result, when you're dealing with something like genocide, this is a platform for inciting. That is the negative part of the sword. The positive part of the sword is it is a platform where we can educate people so that they can be more informed, so that they can be more responsible in the kind of utterances that they make. So in this regard, a key element is putting out information that the tools that people need to engage responsibly, to inform, to be informed. So in controlling hate speech, we can talk about the legal legislative matters. As Dr. Kaufman has said, the criminalization of hate speech in vis-a-vis or denial of the Holocaust on Facebook and so on. But also, obviously, that needs to be extended to other tragedies, the genocide against the Tutsi and so on. So criminalization is one element, but at the same time, information, education. So you criminalize when education has failed. So the people who are intentionally engaging in speech, not out of ignorance, but out of malice, out of carelessness. So the social media, therefore, as it was the case in traditional media, it is a terrain contest for contestation between these genocide deniers and those who are fighting denial. So you have the virtuous on the one hand and the vicious on the other, and all these groups are trying to triumph over the other. So evil, and if you want to talk about metaphysics, so the triumph of evil or the triumph of the good. So this is what's happening. The discourse that is taking place is about this terrain. Who is going to dominate this terrain? Who is going to triumph? And who is going to be isolated? So if you allow the denial of genocide to continue unmitigated, then gradually the deniers are winning because they're getting an upper hand on this platform, and so they get more adherents. So it's like a movement. They get more adherents. So that is the triumph of evil. So the vicious mobilization wins, but at the same time you have the virtuous mobilization that is about the collective consciousness that is needed at different levels of society, as I talked about a little bit earlier. So another thing that I think is critically important is when you talk about freedom, and it is not true that that confronting genocide denial is to trump against freedom, because the freedom, as all other freedoms, requires a certain level of responsibility that comes to it. And the responsibility, when invoked, the responsibility actually is complementary to freedom. So freedom of speech and responsible speech are complementary. There is no contradiction. So this tendency to counterpose freedom and as if controlling, as if moderating, as if challenging uncivil freedom is a trampling against freedom and democracy. It is not true. They are actually complementary issues when done correctly. And when I talk about when done correctly, is about see, all these ideals, whether it's freedom, whether it is human rights, whether it is democracy, we have to understand them within a context, within a historical context and experience of different societies. So how a certain society conceives, understands, and implements practices freedom, whether it's of speech, whether it's democracy, whether it's human rights, we have, although these are universal values, their application have to be within the context of societies. Otherwise, they achieve the opposite of what they intend to achieve. They actually become tools or avenues for disintegrating society, when actually the aim of these values is supposed to bring a much more cohesion and camaraderie and solidarity between, a sense of compatriotism in societies. So again, when we talk about these things, we need to bring them in people's lives. How is freedom felt by a genocide survivor? How is freedom practical? How is freedom of speech practical in the life of a genocide survivor? So any other freedom that tramples upon that, the sense of security of the genocide survivor should not be allowed in a context in which a genocide survivor lives. So finally, I would like to point out that, of course, there are institutions that are responsible for ensuring that there's much more responsible discourse on these. At the national level, we have education systems, we have institutions fighting genocide. They need to be much more proactive in terms of providing information so that we don't have unmitigated genocide denial. You don't have the kind of genocide denial that is premeditated. So then you have at the regional levels, you have for Africa, whether it's African Union, whether it's, but some element of the regional level that needs to take up this effort of building a collective consciousness around the genocide and the potential harm that denial can cause. And of course, at the global level, that is why institutions like the United Nations were put in place to ensure that this collective consciousness is built. And again, in all these levels, it is unfortunate when you see people who should know better when they don't know better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lonzen, for this and for pointing out that we need to create a collective consciousness on and offline, and it will guide our interactions online, and for calling for a regional response to response to this scourge of genocide denial, and contextualizing it so that all these theories make sense, make practical sense to lived experiences of genocide survivors. This is a very important point. So I would like to first thank you so much, the panelists, for these introductory remarks that have touched on all the topics that we were to discuss tonight. So this was most enlightening, insightful, and thank you very much. I will be asking quite a few questions because a lot of it has been covered by you guys. Just as a matter of, just to ensure that we all get a say. We are a bit pressed for time, unfortunately, so we will not be able to engage as fully as we would like. So when I ask a question, I will probably ask one of the panelists. However, if some of the other panelists would like to raise an issue or add a commentary, please raise your hand virtually, and I will give you the floor as well. So first, I'd like to comment on Dr. Brown and Sarah's comment and how, for instance, in 1994 in Rwanda, we had traditional media, but it was maximized in order and it was maximized by the genocidal government in making sure the hate campaign and the hate propaganda reaches the maximum amount of people and desensitizes people. So we've seen how traditional media could also reach such a broad audience. So I would like to ask, with regards to now how the advent of social media platforms, the hate speech and genocide denial theories. My question is coming up. The genocide denial theories, they have unprecedented reach and access right now, even more so than the lonely RTLM, which was quite effective in its hate propaganda. But it can also be said that actual facts and historical accounts of genocide have equal access to these platforms. So, however, it appears that genocide denial and hate speech is getting more ground in this platform, more so than these messages that promote social cohesion and peace. So my question to you, Dr. Brown, from your perspective as an educator in genocide history, what are these strategies that are being employed in genocide denial and hate speech online that you've encountered, and how has that shaped and impacted the work on genocide education?
Thank you for the excellent question and an important question. I remember reading back in, I want to say it was in 2016, that as of 2016, over 60% of Rwanda's population was under the age of 25. And I still remember being there when they were laying fiber optic cables throughout Kigali. I want to say it was in 2010, and just making these tremendous advances and leaps and gains in terms of technology. Rwanda is a technology hub for Central Africa and for the world. And with all of that, Rwanda is a young country. And this youth, the majority population, with all the respect in the world to our elders in Rwanda and the various musees, this is a young country and they grew up internet savvy. They would be who I would call tech natives, not just tech users, right? But being tech savvy doesn't mean that they have media literacy. This is especially difficult when dealing with the deluge of information that you receive online these days. These days, it can be a full-time job just sifting through the news accounts on one single topic, never mind if you want to have a more global understanding of what is going on in the world. It is exhausting. And there are some mechanisms and strategies that are being used to spread hate speech and genocide denial, because often these deniers, they are couching their efforts in buzzwords. They co-opt mainstream rhetoric. They use popular vernacular or euphemisms in order to spread these seeds of doubt, and they make them appear as though they are reasonable expressions of critical thinking or representing, and I get so frustrated, so I'm going to put big quotes around this, the balanced view. These days, a lot of people will retweet, they will quote, they will perpetuate things that they read online, and they don't really examine the source, which is something that I had mentioned to you before that is a source of frustration for me. So what may appear to be some sort of hard-hitting piece of journalism, some investigative, illustrative, incredible point, actually, which maybe they're arguing contributes to this diversity of opinions and universal knowledge and learning, it's actually laced with language that's meant to perpetuate, for example, the double genocide theory, which is favored by so many deniers of the genocide against the Tutsi. Or they will deliberately, they won't deny, because to deny might expose them and their intentions, right? And then it's much easier to counter it in a more effective way. So instead, they'll just sow doubts about the veracity of one particular fact or a few facts without directly or openly denying the genocide occurred. Then there's also something called clickbaiting, which I think is a really important point that we do need to talk about. Manufacturing headlines that are deliberately worded in order to draw in readers. They're engineered to make you want to click on them. Now, this isn't a strategy that is solely used by extremists, and this is something Dr. Kaufman talked about. These are neutral strategies, actually, that are used by news agencies all over the world. Those clever headlines are often as important as the content that they cover. But for the media savvy, these are also difficult to avoid. You get sucked in, you click on something and you realize you've actually been drawn into a hate website, or the content that it claims to cover is not actually what's represented in the headline. For a younger or more inexperienced reader, this is dangerous. And I want to cite an example that's actually from here in the United States, the example of the neo-Nazi, hate-filled, nefarious conspiracy theory website called the Daily Stormer. Now, the editor of the Daily Stormer, this is a hate-filled site. They promote anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, anti-women. They promote not just hatred, but also violence. The editor once openly bragged about designing content and clickbait that was intended to lure in children as young as 11 years old and radicalize them. They might stumble on the site lured by a headline that doesn't advertise what they're about to, the website they're about to enter, or the fact that they're about to be radicalized. Instead, it uses loud, brash headlines that draw in readers with very little context. These are just a couple of the strategies that we're seeing employed in a variety of different ways to perpetuate hate rhetoric, genocide denial, be it of the Holocaust. And Dr. Kaufman made a great point that, yes, the Facebook is now, for example, they have acknowledged that denying the Holocaust is hate speech. But how are they enforcing it? And are they being transparent in their enforcement? Are they being uniform in their enforcement? And why aren't they expanding this to include denial of the genocide against the Tutsi, denial of the Armenian genocide? Where is the political will on their part in order to engage in much better policing of themselves, which is of course problematic to begin with because they are more beholden to their shareholders than they are their users. Policing of themselves, but also policing of the content that is being spread online. Those are just a few of the things I want to highlight. I will not argue that education is a panacea, meaning that it would fix everything, but educating our youth and our adults, actually, there are plenty of adults that fall trap to this as well, about media literacy, examining the sources, going past buzzwords and popular vernacular, realizing when words are being co-opted and they're intended to mean one thing, but they are being manipulated and used by others to perpetuate something else. Those are all strong first steps that we all should be taking, both at home, in the classroom, and in society.
Thank you very much for so succinctly explaining all the pitfalls that are present in our online interactions, how even the most not even to say most casual observer, even the most interested observer might fall into those traps, especially you've touched on an important point on how they have co-opted the language of survivors and the language of genocide education. And this is how they lower you into denial and revisionism and distortion of facts under the guise of, objectivity and diversity of thoughts and opinions. And this is something that is actually that we've actually encountered with especially as it pertains to the genocide against the Tutsis. And I would like to address this question to Dr. Lonzen, who's a longtime commentator on the phenomenon of hate speech and genocide denial, as it pertains to, especially to the genocide against the Tutsi specifically. How would you say what are the most popular avenues that they use in spreading this misinformation? And what are these mechanisms and strategies, and do you feel they've been successful in a sense that, do you feel that to the casual observer, they might turn him in a side, I would say, against genocide survivors and espouse entirely the side of the perpetrators? You're unmuted, Lonzen. You need to switch on your microphone.
All right, thank you. How is it? How is that?
Perfect, I can hear you. We can.
Okay, I'm good. Okay, well, the way they are doing it to lure people, especially young people, the deniers, they are pretending to be activists of democracy and human rights. So they lure young people as if they are promoting democracy and human rights, as if they are critics of government, but when their discourse is denialist. So it's genocide ideology. That is the thought system that they use to pursue democracy and human rights is genocide ideology. So that's how they lure young people. That is why we need to equip young people to identify, to distinguish what constitutes genocide denial, to give them information so that they know when someone brings genocide denial as if when the discourse should be about democracy and human rights, that you are able to flag it. If you are informed, you can flag it. So much of that is taking place of course, on Twitter, on Facebook, and very much so on YouTube. So there's a lot of genocide denial that is camouflaged in the discourse on democracy and human rights. So it has branches from the international level when you have people like Philip Rangens, Judy Rever, and it goes all the way to the ground to YouTubers who promote, whose discourse is entirely genocide denial and a mockery of survivors, genocide survivors. But they have these benefactors at the international level that defend them, saying that they are human rights defenders, when they are people who mock the very existence of survivors every day. So these people, the same way RTLM had its sponsors, Kabuga and so on. This movement also has its sponsors. So whenever they are, whether it's YouTube, whether it's Twitter, they have the Kabugas of the latter day Kabugas who are funding them as well. So when you see Jambo, RSBL, there's offspring of genocide perpetrators. So when you see them operating, you have to think about the Kabuga that is behind them. So when we talk about social media, and we say that it is doing things that RTLM did, somehow we don't bring up who is the Kabuga. Yeah, but there are many Kabugas taking there, and they are funding this denial. It's a movement. So we need to counter it. We need to reject this idea that they are pursuing human rights, and we need to give information to young people to distinguish what human rights are and what genocide denial is. And we need to be very clear that whether it is democracy, whether it is human rights, whether it is all those very good ideals that are universal, whenever they are contextualized whenever they come in Rwanda, they must manifest themselves within the context of the lived experience of Rwandans. So we will not accept any democracy or human right that mocks survivors.
Well, thank you very much, Lonzen. And actually, you've touched on something that is quite important on just to give some context to people who do not know who those people that you mentioned are. Rangen and Judy River are some so-called academics that have been engaging in genocide denial. This Philip Rangen is a Belgian academic who has engaged in genocide denial. Actually, he was a close collaborator with the genocide government at the time and helped them draft a constitution that was very anti-Tutsi. And in the end, he is now still, these people are still invited and accepted into these academic circles that are implicitly trusted by the public as credible organizations that would not just bring anybody. So, and this is something that you've touched on when you talked about Kabuga, who was the financier of RTLM. He was the owner of RTLM. So this would be to basically to equate him like just to equate him to like the owners of these social media companies, the Zuckerbergs of this world. So my next question is actually about the role and how to some practical ways to internet corporations can become part of the solution. As mentioned, you know, they are the problem, but they can also be used for good, as mentioned by Dr. Brown. So my question is to Castro. Zachary mentioned as well that there's been confirmed reports of Facebook being used as the main platform to incite genocide against the Rohingyas. The systematic hate speech campaign went undetected for nearly a decade and led to the genocidal violence exacted on the Rohingyas. And this demonstrates how online violence inevitably leads to offline violence. So to Castro, my question is, how can we turn this around and use this social media platform as part of the solution, especially in terms of early warning of imminent atrocities?
Thank you very much, Doris. And in my introductory remarks, I highlighted again, the point of, that the social media and tech companies are actually, as one of the presenters says, it's double-edged sword, but we can use them in a constructive way, and have played a very significant role. And some of the panelists, have given very good examples, like, media content can be used, actually, images and all that can be preserved and used as evidence that could be used to investigate some of the most serious cases, that is what is going on, for example, in Myanmar or in Syria. And therefore, that's the positive side, and also just informing people. But at the same time, we have seen these social media and tech companies used in a very abusive way in propagating hate, incitement, towards discrimination, violence, and to the worst cases, genocide, and genocide denial on itself. Okay, so one of the things, as I've said from my introduction, and some of the speakers have said, is the transparency process of how Facebook, social media, take down content. Okay, so we should not just be satisfied that a post has been pulled down. Okay, we would want to understand the policies behind the process of taking down content that is insightful, or it's hate speech, or is genocide denial. As Kaufman said, if you go on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, and you post anti-Semitic, content, you post, discriminative, content or against any group, it's something that already there's clear legislations in various countries about that, and therefore we can see a response. I think we need to do a little bit more advocacy. Of course, there's one side, which is legislation at national level, but with the tech companies, we must hold them accountable, that they explain, in terms of their processes of dealing with hateful content on their platforms. The second point is accountability. We have a very good example of what is happening currently in Nigeria, of where Nigeria has shut down Twitter, of course. On one side, of course, and there's, Lonzen has referred to the issues of fundamental freedoms of opinion and expression, vis-a-vis the platform being used to incite the population. Now, the level of, when we talk about incitement, the boundary, Doris, is very clear because there's international law that prohibits incitement, okay? But we cannot hide behind the fundamental freedoms of expression and opinion to disseminate hate speech, which because at international level, because it has not been legally defined, that we can still hide behind the fundamental freedoms to propagate hate speech, because we have seen what hate speech brings up to. And therefore, there should be full accountability that despite the fact that the content is not incitement, that these tech companies should be held accountable if the platform itself is propagating, is being used to propagate hateful messages, incitement, but which includes genocide denial. The third point, which I also mentioned, is the oversight mechanisms. And Kaufman mentioned this. We have entrusted the big tech companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, for self-regulation. Okay, which we have said it's a good thing. That's what has given them power to kind of like take the information into the ordinary folks. Now the story is being told by the ordinary people, but that story can easily be hijacked. If the purpose of the tech and media companies is profit, they're in business, and I have got 1 million followers, of which they can benefit quite a lot in terms of marketing, you can see the conflict here. Besides, taking down Castro's content, who has got 6 million followers or 2 million followers, vis-a-vis the business that we're gonna lose because of taking down that. Okay, so we need some oversight mechanism, and the tech companies should agree that, besides themselves self-regulation, there should be some other oversight mechanisms if actually we are going to deal with this very growing and concerning, problem of hate speech, genocide denial, and including incitement online. And we are seeing actually people dying, violence. Look at the attacks against migrants or indigenous communities, and also now going back to genocide denial, what it does to survivors. If we're going to build back a society that is cohesive, then we must have some external oversight mechanisms. The last point, which some of you have said, is partnership. I don't see how Facebook will be able to take down all hateful content if they are not going to do partnership with the local languages. Okay, if I post something in Amharic or in Kinyarwanda or in any other language that is not one of the mainstream languages in the world, is Facebook's business model designed in such a way that they will be able to detect that? No. All they tell you is that they will depend on self-reporting. So they have to trust somebody somewhere who will say, hey, this post is hateful in the Kinyarwanda or in Amharic or in Kiswahili. They should do partnerships with journalists, civil society, indigenous communities, go down to the ground to the affected. The genocide against the Tutsi happened in Rwanda, and therefore there should be really a lot of sensitivities of how to deal with respecting the survivors of the genocide against the Tutsi. So it should not be a generic approach in itself. And the last point, and this is very important again also to partnerships, is proportionality and impact. Okay, so if the victims are telling you this is wrong, what has been posted is wrong. I'm the survivor, I'm the victim. I'm telling you it's wrong. It's instigating discrimination. I feel like it's maybe racist, or it's anti-Semitic, or Islamophobia or whatever. I'm telling you as a victim. I think it's very important to take into consideration the opinion, the expressions of the surviving groups and the protected groups themselves. They cannot operate as though the voice of those who are the victims of hate speech doesn't count on itself. I'll stop over there, Doris. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Castro. And you've touched on an important point on moderation, which speaks to the limitation of self-regulations by these corporations, as Dr. Kaufman was saying, that they have limitations. So, and you've touched on this constant struggle between the right to freedom of speech and the fight against hate speech, which is something that is present. It's a struggle that is present in most legal systems, I think, as Zachary will probably confirm. So I have a question for Zachary, especially like we understand this is an age-old fight between freedom of speech and fight against hate speech. But I feel like the digital sphere brings a new layer of complexity in terms of, with regards to jurisdiction, when talking about accountability, with regards to which jurisdiction applies, and the anonymity that the internet confers to those who engage in hate speech. So what are the legal trends around online hate speech versus free speech, especially as it pertains to those aspects? How do we hold these people accountable despite these problems?
Thank you, Doris. Thank you for such an easy question. I appreciate that. The jurisdictional questions involved in hate speech that is propagated in one country but hosted by a corporation in a different country are enormously complicated. You know, if a social media company is headquartered in, for example, the United States, they can, of their own volition, because they're a private corporation, take down content and accounts that they find objectionable because they violate community standards or codes of conduct. The speech itself may not be criminalized, for example, in the United States, but could be criminalized in that foreign country. There are, you know, over a dozen countries around the world, not including the United States, but that do criminalize genocide denial. And so it may very well be a crime in that country for a person to post certain content, whether it's text or images or video, to social media, but it wouldn't necessarily be criminalized where the social media company is hosted. So you're absolutely right to you know, raise the delicate jurisdictional issues that come about. And at the end of the day, this issue, I think, is a combination of not only legal questions, but also political and technological and corporate questions. You know, what are corporations willing to do, and what can civil society push them to do in order to voluntarily combat genocide denial and incitement? And then the question, you know, is in a particular jurisdiction, what can the law do to hold, you know, inciters and deniers accountable? And that really varies all across the world. But, you know, on the plus side, I think there really is a growing recognition that incitement and denial are not just misinformation. They're not just, you know, speech like other speech that might be offensive, but is not necessarily criminal. There is rather a growing recognition that such speech is, or at least should be, criminal. And so we're seeing laws spread or expand. So to address an issue that Dr. Brown raised, you know, while there is criminalization of Holocaust denial, some places there isn't necessarily criminalization of other genocide denial. And if the principle is in place that denying the genocide against the Jews is not only offensive but harmful, then that should obviously, I would think, apply to all genocides. And so there are some measures being taken to now criminalize the denial of any atrocity crime that's recognized by an international tribunal. And so that would include modern genocides since the Holocaust, including the genocide against the Tutsi. But you're absolutely right, Doris, that, you know, the legal issues are sort of the cutting edge and really thorny issues that that lawyers, judges, law professors, and activists are struggling with. And, you know, unfortunately, given that so many politicians are tragically Luddites, they have very little familiarity with modern technology, especially online technology. They don't quite grasp the real consequence of social media yet. And that, unfortunately, I think is impeding real progress in terms of lawmaking and judicial rulings on social media in this space that concerns us all. So thanks for the question, and this is something that will continue to be wrestled with for years to come, and because it's such the cutting edge of legal issues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaufman. I have so many follow-up questions, but unfortunately we are pressed for time. But I would like to just ask you quickly, if you could, just a quick follow-up, if you could just very quickly tell us, now we've seen that these social media corporations are not just some neutral entities that are merely offering a platform to all. They are also active stakeholders who can amplify and restrict hate speech. But we also see that is the trend moving at least towards holding these corporations accountable for the way they manipulate the algorithm sometimes and amplify hate speech?
Rather than holding social media companies legally accountable, I definitely see trends towards holding social media companies politically or morally accountable. And that very well may be a precursor to legal accountability, or it may not be. But there definitely is a growing recognition and demand that social media companies do more. I really think that the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar has been in many ways a real turning point for social media companies and recognition and appreciation for the role that they can and unfortunately have played in genocides. Since the vast recognition that Facebook was used to perpetrate the genocide, and the demonstration of the power that Facebook had to restrict such speech where it was willing to do so, there's more demand than ever on Facebook and other social media companies to play such an active role. And when you combine that with the recognition of how many resources, how financially profitable social media companies are, there are real questions for why they don't hire more staff to moderate and monitor content, and why they don't, like Mr. Wasamba mentioned, hire indigenous language experts to monitor and translate language. And I would add that there's another problem too. It's not just the mere translation of indigenous languages, which you could, for example, use Google Translate to maybe do, but it's also the cultural appreciation of euphemisms. So as we all know too well, in the case of the genocide against the Tutsi, euphemisms were used that might not make much sense to a non-Kinyarwanda or non-Kinyarwanda speaker or non-Rwandan. So things like do your work, or cut down the tall trees, or using certain words like Inyinzi for cockroach and other words to demonize and dehumanize Tutsi, and also to incite violence against them. That all is needed beyond mere translation, the understanding of culture. And so Facebook and other social media companies need to be hiring more linguists and cultural experts to really appreciate and combat genocide, incitement, and denial. And with the vast resources that Facebook and other companies have, these are some of the most profitable and well-endowed companies in the world. There is no excuse not to do so. In fact, it is morally incumbent upon them to do so. And aggressive lawmakers may find ways to make it also legally required as well.
Thank you so much for that. We have taken up a lot of the time of the Q&A, so we've had to restrict some of the questions that are coming through, unfortunately. But I would like to just give the floor to the attendees. They've sent in some questions. We've taken two that we think cut across the board, and we'll give the panelists an opportunity to give just some concluding thoughts. So I will definitely direct some of the questions to one of you, but please, anyone else who would like to add a comment to that is free to do so, so you can provide your concluding thoughts on the matter. So our first question, I think it will be most likely to be answered by Dr. Brown first. Because something that she mentioned, given that digital media is a growing industry, especially in developing countries, to what extent can media literacy counter genocide denial? And where should the line be drawn when it comes to media regulation?
I'm going to echo what Zach said, and thank you for an easy question. It's actually quite challenging, and it's up to each country to determine what the policies and regulations are going to be. I think going at it in that piecemeal approach, rather than going directly to the source, the corporations themselves, is a little bit problematic. And it could also leave windows open for certain countries to limit social media, but in order to perpetuate or achieve their own political goals of suppressing free speech. This is something that Castro mentioned with respect to Nigeria, and also China has a long history of doing the same. So I would warn against a more piecemeal approach, and I think that there's actually an opportunity here for survivor groups to band together and start lobbying the larger corporations in conjunction with their respective governments in order to enact better policies and start pushing for things like linguists and transparent monitoring, and to make it, maybe they don't have the political will currently to take meaningful action. We have to make it a part of the agenda and make it a part of their priorities. Realize that this is part of doing good business. This is part of doing ethical business. Many businesses these days are very responsive to the idea that they want to be seen as pro-human rights. And they want to be seen as more in the progressive camp and responsive to the needs of people. And oftentimes, unfortunately, it's a numbers game. And so they have to be effectively lobbied, and it has to be framed as good for business to take meaningful action. Again, I'm leaning away from this idea of on a country by country basis litigating what is acceptable in that country. Going directly to the source, I think, might be a slightly more proactive and meaningful way. But I also want to note that, because the internet it works both ways. It is user content and the users play a significant role too. There are ways to empower media watchdogs and work with organizations like the Anti-Defamation League or the SPLC. They both investigate and expose hate online. And there is a way to start reaching out to those organizations and other survivor groups and start marshaling individuals to come together and expose and speak out against hate rhetoric as it is coming out. Oftentimes, and this is something I see repeatedly, the extremists take the megaphone and the rest of us choose to ignore rather than to engage. And at some point, we do need to start effectively mobilizing and enacting some sort of countermeasure so that it is not seen that we are complicit by attrition or as a result of our silence, or that we, God forbid, people think we agree. So there needs to be more effective on the part of the individual, on the part of survivor groups, on the part of, all of us here at attendance. We need to start taking more meaningful action to make sure that we are also living the example and setting the example.
Thank you so much. Would anybody would like to add anything to it, especially as it pertains to, the push and pull with media regulations, as you said, because you want to move away from piecemeal. And I think Dr. Lonzen actually mentioned it, but he termed it more as a cultivating public consciousness. Would you like to add something to this question?
Thank you.
The microphone
Thank you,
is off here. Okay, good. I can hear you now.
Yes, the is needed. Now, of course, corporations, the only language they understand is the bottom line. So when you build the collective consciousness, then it is that collective consciousness that is able to nudge corporations towards doing the right thing, because the bottom line is affected. So until you have that critical consciousness, so all our efforts should be in building the collective consciousness that will build a leverage against these corporations. And this is what I'm saying. If we have a collective at different levels, collectives that are well informed, that have the requisite sensibility about genocide, then these collectives can pressure these corporations. That's where, when I talked about when RTLM was broadcasting, the solution that was given was that the Americans should come and bomb it, so switch it off. Of course, the Americans refused because they said it would constrain freedom of speech, but that was a solution. Now, a similar logic works this way as well. Instead of telling the Americans, we're telling the corporation. If it is Twitter, if it is YouTube, we're telling them, bomb this, switch this off. But that is only possible if you have a certain kind of leverage to use in that discussion. Otherwise, they don't care.
Yes, and speaking of leverage, I would like to, because to direct the next audience question to Castro, who's representing the UN Office on Genocide Prevention. And I feel like the UN has the leverage as such a powerful institution. This question is moves a bit more in the sense of education. They say the question is, digital platforms provide users with access to third-party perspectives, which can be misleading at times. It's something we've been discussing. How do you see education incorporating digital tools to protect young people from online misinformation? It's about incorporating education in digital tools. Yes.
Thank you very much, Doris. And I think, this is an issue that builds on, first of all, what Lonzen has just said about collective consciousness and how do you raise that collective consciousness. The biggest user of some of these, social media and tech companies, of course, everybody's using it, but also very popular with young people. And in fact, when we were talking to TikTok, and how it's used, and you realize that you have to pay attention also to the end use on that. And if it's very difficult, as Dr. Kaufman has said, as what Sara has said, if we go to the source and say we want to impose certain regulations against the digital companies, how it's a very monumentous task, because they're based elsewhere, they're governed by different laws and regulations, but they're affecting a population that is very, kind of removed from the Silicon Valley or what you're talking about. So one of the things that the UN and we are advocating for is counter narratives, educating people to really know what the facts are. And when people know that if you create a whole pool of people, and Sara has said it very well, that those who are propagating hate and genocide deniers, sometimes they are so loud, and sometimes, as they've said, a common saying, it takes just the silence of the good for the evil to prevail. So we have to create a voice, a mass voice, that is well educated through our education system, through memorization, young people to be very much aware of what happened in the Holocaust, what happened in the genocide against the Tutsi, what happened in the genocide in Cambodia, so that they're very much aware and they can offer counter narratives. The problem why we are actually acting on this third-party information and actually we end up, believing it, is because we don't have the counter narratives. And those who have the counter narratives are not speaking up. So we need to create a pool through education, both at national levels, at international level. UNESCO, we are partnering with UNESCO to create various programs through education and prevention of genocide. We are supporting, memorialization is very, very important. Lonzen mentioned about regional mechanisms. I don't know how much African Union is doing about African citizens just to be aware of what happened in 1994? How many African young people know exactly what happened? When you say Eritrea or when you say Kabuga, how many African citizens know that other than the professors and well-exposed and educated people? So we have to really do more to the young people through education to create counter narratives. So when the hate comes out, we are not worried about the hate because we know it's hate, we can see it. And we cannot hide behind the fundamental freedoms to say that that hate is correct, okay? But you can only be able to do that if you are well empowered through that collective consciousness, through education, and the United Nations, working with UNESCO and other relevant, actors, governments, and all that. We are very, very keen to see that there's genocide prevention through education. That's the only way we're going to counter the hate, not the corporations necessarily. Thank you.
Doris, may I add a few thoughts?
Yes, please. I was going to ask you to add some. Yes,
I just wanted to add a few thoughts about the role of the United Nations. Mr. Wasamba and his colleagues are doing such incredible work, and I just wanted to add a few additional thoughts about what the UN can do and has done. First of all, there's really no international legal definition of hate speech, and that's a real problem because it's such a contested concept and it's disputed all over the world. The United Nations has been working on a strategy and plan of action on hate speech. And I just wanted to note that because I think this is an extremely important effort to finally, get everybody on the same page as to what hate speech is and what it does. And so I wanted to commend Mr. Wasamba and his colleagues on this initiative. I also wanted to note two other things. When the United Nations decided to recognize the genocide in 1994 in Rwanda as the genocide against the Tutsi, in many ways, I think that helped to clarify for some quite officially to whom the genocide was directed. And that was a significant initiative that the United Nations undertook, and rightly so. And then third, I also want to note, as a lawyer and law professor, the important measures that the UN continues to take to promote justice for genocide. So the recent arrest and upcoming prosecution of Felicien Kabuga at the residual mechanism, the successor entity to the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, is hugely important. He was the lead financier of RTLM, and other aspects of the genocide, in many ways may have been the single most important individual contributor to the genocide. And it took over a quarter century to finally apprehend him when he was hiding in France, but that has now been done, and the United Nations is taking steps to finally be able to bring him to justice. And through justice, just like with education, genocide, incitement, and denial can be combated. And so again, I just want to commend Mr. Wasamba and his colleagues at the UN for all of the various initiatives that they've been undertaking to combat genocide, incitement, and denialism.
Thank you so much for that. And we are looking forward to the implementation of the strategy and plan of action on hate speech. Unfortunately, our time is up. I would like to thank you all so much for participating, for taking time out of what I'm sure are very busy schedule to discuss this and shed light on this phenomenon of hate speech and genocide denial online. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I would like to also thank our distinguished attendees who stuck with us. This is an ongoing conversation, and I hope that you get to follow the work of these panelists to be better informed. You can ZacharyKaufman.com. He has a website that provides important information. There's the UN Office of Genocide Prevention as well. You can Google that. There's Dr. Sara Brown's organization of change. With 2 H's. So if you look for it online, you will get even more information. And there is Dr. Lonzen Rugira, who's a frequent contributor to the Pan-African Review, where he assesses all of these aspects that he's discussed in greater details. So I hope you manage to go out and find out this information instead of just relying on these social media that might mislead. I would like to open the floor to the closing remarks by the Rwandan Permanent Mission's Chargé d'Affaires and Deputy representative, Mr. Robert Kainamura. Please take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Doris. And mine is just a thank you note, and to thank you, Doris, for really taking us through this conversation. And also join to thank the panelists. Thank you very much. And most of you are not new to this conversation. And we've seen the Office of Genocide Prevention, Dr. Kaufman, Sara Brown, Lonzen Rugira. You have been at the forefront of this conversation, and we recognize that. I think takeaways is from this useful conversation and great thoughts, observations, particularly as relates to the topic, is how are we going to translate these observations into tangible actions to prevent, which brings to the point of what Castro mentioned. Because we can fail, all of us, if we don't act. We can fail and then we go back to where we came from. And yet, when you see the writing of Professor Kaufman, is writing to give information to prevent, that we don't need to go back into this hate speech and all kind of stuff. But I think there must be a way forward, as all of you have mentioned. How do we bring public and private sector on the same page on this conversation? How do we create a critical mass around this issue? Because today is different from 70 years ago, where we have all this information. As much as the tools can be used by the spoilers, I think we need to create also a critical mass on spreading the good message, but at the same time putting pressure. I think Professor Lonzen mentioned it. We need to put pressure on these online tech companies, and we have also seen media. This is not something that the Office of Genocide Prevention will do alone. This is not something that the Office of Permanent Mission or Rwanda government will do alone. We need all to come together and try to see how we can create a positive change, and we don't repeat to the never again we have always been saying. To conclude, I want to conclude on the point that Professor Kaufman just mentioned. Really, UN has been very active in terms, and I'm speaking now, we have colleagues, member states, in terms of creating the right platforms that we give to the Office of Genocide Prevention to implement. And the Office of the UN Office on Global Communication, headed by Under Secretary General Madame Fleming, has been at the front line of debunking misinformation, including genocide denial, as a matter of fact. When what Mrs. Zachary mentioned, when the UN changed the terminology itself, I remember I was part of that conversation and negotiations. The UN recognized the genocide against the Tutsi, including the fact that it was not only that it was targeting the Tutsi, but the mere fact that you opposed the extermination of Tutsis, you would not survive. And this is, I think, what Under Secretary General was trying to mean. It's not like the UN's at the forefront of genocide, fighting genocide denial, misinformation, and as Professor Zachary mentioned, they're really doing incredible job, but they cannot do it alone. We as member states, we need to help these offices, because these offices represent our own interests. So we need to create also a critical mass from the civil society organizations that are there to support these offices, that are there to support member states as creating the right mindset. Because if we don't do that, then we're likely to repeat or to stay in the same vicious circle. But I believe that, as most of you panelists have said, we have what it takes. What it takes is action. It's not that these bad guys who are spreading the lie can really voice much than we do. If they have the guts to go on these platforms, we can also use them to spread the good message. And then accountability party comes in. individually or collectively in terms of holding these multilateral corporations also accountable. I think what Lonzen mentioned, the Facebook will hear when there's a critical mass. New York Times, when it publishes wrong information or misinformation, it will also listen to critical masses when they always question the authenticity of what what they wrote. And of course, we take cognizance of the fact that we need to strike a right balance of freedom of expression, freedom of, but not freedom to misinform and to create misinformation. Now, on behalf of our mission, thank you very much. And on behalf of the UN Global Communication, we really thank you very much. We look forward to having this conversation again. Doris, thank you very much for taking us through this conversation. We look forward, I think this is a conversation we need to continue. And to our audience, to colleagues within the UN, thank you very much. And over to you back to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your closing remarks. I think everything has been said in terms of saying goodbye to everyone and thanking everyone. So I would like to yet again thank you for joining us, all of you guys. And well, you can rewatch a recording of this on the YouTube page of the Rwandan Mission. I'm sure if you would like to rewatch some of these portions. So I would say goodbye and farewell. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Kwibuka Podcast. As always, make sure you leave us a review, sharing what you like